How necessary are emotions and what role should they be playing in our lives? Can we pursue good without them? Can AI have true personhood? This wasn't a big standout week in DC Comics for me, but one comic in particular played around with things relevant to all of those questions. Hi, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues Weekly, where I talk about DC Comics 1 week after their release on the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. In each installment, I pick an assortment of comics to talk about as a DC fan and also explore what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, full spoilers for everything I talk about. That's your first and only warning. Right now, we're taking a look at comics originally released to the Ultra tier on September 10th, 2025, originally published on August 13th, 2025. First from that group is Superman, the Kryptonite Spectrum #1. This is a part of DC's Black Label line of comics, which it's kind of muddy in terms of, are these part of DC continuity or not? This one does not seem to be. It basically has a setting in which Lois Lane is in her 40s and is dating Superman, does not seem to know his identity, but she feels her biological clock ticking and is kind of, ready to kind of set aside this relationship. So that clearly seems to be outside of mainstream DC continuity. That's one of the big reasons that I'm probably not going to continue reading this book. I really am most interested in all the stories that are a part of the shared continuity in DC publishing. That said, it's still touching on some somewhat interesting things. It's introducing quote-unquote new colors of Kryptonite and the effects that they have. But the vibe of the book, the logic at times is not working for me. Characters are making kind of foolish decisions because, like, for example, these new shades of Kryptonite show up, and Superman feels the responsibility to figure out what they do so that if these get into the wrong hands, they can be ready for what effect it might have on Superman. But his solution is, we got to test them on me. Like, okay, shoot me with a beam of this stuff. He gets Batman to help him out. That's the way that they should test it. It's the idea of testing it on his individual cells isn't even brought up, but that seems like a no-brainer. That's where you start. You start by getting some blood or cells, whatever Superman needs to do to get some cells off of his skin or whatever, but get this stuff under a microscope. What do you mean you're going to have it shoot you full in the chest with purple kryptonite and see what happens? So, and there's other little things here and there that I feel like there's a seriousness to the vibe, but yet logistically and conceptually, there are a few silly things that I'm like, I'm not quite on board with this. So anyway, that's Superman, the Kryptonite Spectrum #1. Probably will not be commenting on any more in that series. Then we've got Action Comics 1089, which is still part of the Summer of Superman event, and this storyline has been going back to the early years of Clark Kent first putting on some kind of costume and learning to use his powers to try and do good. And so he is this kind of unformed Superman, this Superboy that people are starting to get hints of. He's showing up in tabloids or blurry images of newsreels and stuff like that. Do you call them newsreels anymore? Was that just in the... I guess that's probably just in the 40s or something. Anyway, like I said last time, I've got mixed feelings about reestablishing a Superboy period as opposed to him just kind of learning about his powers without a costume and really becoming Superman when he's older. But I'm warming up to this. I'm liking the portrayal of the Kents and stuff. Well, in this issue, it's not super sucking me in. Captain Comet is introduced as a character who has been under the radar and was a hero back in the day that Martha Kent heard stories about. But he shows up because he's aware now of Clark and his abilities and wants to make sure that Clark is not going to go down the dark path that other aliens in space and other civilizations have gone down that resulted in mass destruction of their planets and their people because their own powers got out of control. And so I don't know. I'm less interested. This feels like a little bit just kind of almost a random injection of a character, and it feels less like a development, a through line of what came before. I think thematically we'll probably see a through line once this story is all said and done. We look back retrospectively at it. But as of now, it seems like, what, Captain Comet? That feels like a bit of a a crazy left turn. So I'm not sure that I'm super into where this story is going at this point, but we'll see. That's Superman in Action Comics 1089. Then we've got Aquaman number 8 being written by Jeremy Adams, who, if you haven't seen my interview with him yet, is just search Jeremy Adams on the Christian Geek Central YouTube channel. He was gracious enough to give me about an hour of time to deep dive with him, asking him questions about how his Christian faith affects his writing. A lot of interesting things came out in that conversation, so check that out if you haven't already. But anyway, Aquaman number 8, I mentioned with 7 that I'm loving what has happened with Arthur Curry's powers, that he has now the power to manipulate water. That's a power I felt like he should have had for decades now. And finally, it's been given to him. But the story that's coming along with it is this kind of like adventuring, almost a sword and sorcery vibe kind of story. And it's fine, but it's not really what I want. When he's getting this new power, and it seems like it's going to be here for good, well, just in general anyway, I would prefer a story that's more introspective, that's more exploring how he's feeling about his new powers. Now, there is some introspection. There's still, in this issue, going back to conversations with his father at the lighthouse and stuff, so there is some good stuff there, but most of it is just plot moving forward, and I think a lot of readers are going to enjoy and appreciate that, but I am someone that really likes it to be more character-driven, more consistently character-oriented, and I guess introspective or whatever. But I don't think that's what this story is. We'll see. It looks like we're coming to a climax. There's a big use of his water powers on a huge new level that they don't really explain and get into. But because he takes out Dagon, this basically a god of some kind of the sea, this dark Lovecraftian kind of god of the sea, and Aquaman takes him out with this kind of moment of self-discovery of his true power levels with manipulating water. It's not clear, even in the scene, what exactly is going on, how he survived from this seemingly fatal wound. But the tease for issue 9 is the aftermath, and so I'm wondering if in issue 9 we're going to have him reflecting back and readers are going to better understand what exactly happened. How did he heal himself with his water power? What exactly has he unlocked now? So issue 8, not super interesting to me, but I'm very interested in what's going to come in issue 9, because I think we're going to get some interesting answers, some maybe the new status quo going forward for Aquaman and his powers, even more solidly established in issue 9. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what's going to happen there. Then finally, we've got Green Lantern Corps number 7, which Adams co-writes with Hampton. So I'm not sure how much of the interesting things going on philosophically in Green Lantern Corps number 7 are because of Adams' involvement or Hampton's involvement, but there are several interesting ideas being explored in some ways that seem fairly consistent with Christian thinking. Others that's like, I don't know, but it's at least leaving the door open. So first, briefly about the story itself, we're dealing with kind of like Starbreaker and his own kind of core now, and they are kind of absorbing all these emotions, and we find out really their involvement behind all this stuff going on with the emotional spectrum. The big cliffhanger at the end of the last part of this story was that emotions have basically been shut off. Every sentient being has been cut off from emotions in the universe, and so we're seeing the after effects of that in Green Lantern Corps 7, where people are not bothering to defend themselves, they're not bothering to pursue the things that they really value and they really care about because their emotions are gone. And so there's all kinds of opportunities here to be exploring the role of emotions in our lives. And then also there's a little bit of stuff with AI and potential sentience or personhood, maybe I should say, of AI. So let me get into some examples here. The first example is John Stewart sitting in his room or his quarters, and he's just completely just kind of dead and apathetic toward what is going on. Actually, the expression on his face looks a little bit on the sad side, but I think we're supposed to understand this as being just apathetic. And his ring is talking to him saying, John, people are being killed and everyone is just welcoming death. John, listen to your mother. And he answers, talking to his ring, you're not my mother. You're just a ring. A ring, I said, was imbued with the essence of my mother, but that was a lie, one nobody challenged out of fear that the truth was too much for me to handle. Now, you may not remember, in fact, my memories of it are vague, and so I might accidentally misrepresent it here, for which I apologize, but in, what was it? It was a solo series that he had briefly, I think a mini-series that didn't continue on to a regular series, and his mother was dying, and I think what he did eventually at the end there was, it was suggested that his mother was continuing to live, her spirit or something, inside of his ring. And I remember reading that at the time and feeling very weird about that. I was like, if this continues, it seems a bit short-sighted, because, okay, yes, his mother, who was dying, who was suffering from dementia, it was a very sad situation. But to have her survive in the ring, it's like, do you really, as an adult man, even though we would want, of course, our parents to continue living, as an adult man, do you really want your mom, it's like, hiding around in your brain, essentially, interacting with you on a pure mental level because she's in your power ring all the time? It's like, this is... long term, I don't think this works very well. So this moment potentially yanks the rug out from under the happy ending that was supposed to be giving us, I think, of his mother surviving. But at the same time, there is a little bit of wiggle room for wondering whether or not John really understands the truth of the situation. What is kind of being retconned here is the idea that his mother did survive, that now that he's been stripped of emotion, he is okay with facing the truth. He says, now that all emotion is gone, there's no reason to pretend you are anything more than my pain and regret made manifest. And then we see a close-up on the ring just being silent for a moment, and then the dialogue for the ring says, oh, hell no. And so the question is at this moment, okay, the ring, or the simulated personality of the ring, or his mother inside the ring, whatever the case may be, is not quote-unquote liking this, and is responding and is going to be taking some action to try and remedy the situation of John being inactive about anything because of his lack of emotion. And then things kind of like continue from there. But they never really get more clear in this story about what we are supposed to think as readers. Now, I think on an emotional level, and most fiction is appealing to us on an emotional level, that's very important to say. So I think typically with the way fiction functions, we are meant to feel like this actually is his mother, actually has a personality, because of course John is in a pitiable state that we as readers should not want him to stay in, and so we should be agreeing with a sentiment that says, no, he needs to wake up from that. At the same time, that kind of encourages us to be sympathetic toward the ring who wants to wake him up, and the potential for it to be a person who wants him to wake up, namely his mother. And so the emotional elements in play are, I think, encouraging the reader to go along with the idea that this is a person that John should listen to his ring, or more specifically, his mother. But there is still room left for those of us who, would disagree with the idea that personhood can be quantified in only a physical reality, namely a copying of information that is then copied over into a ring. Now, of course, we're dealing with these weird sci-fi concepts. Is there the possibility that the right kind of conditions were created by copying his mother's memories, the right kinds of conditions were created in the ring for her intangible, non-physical spirit to sort of jump from her dying body and then inhabit this ring? I think that there's kind of like a Battlestar Galactica thing about that scenario. If you remember the mid-2000s Battlestar Galactica series, it's pretty hard, grounded sci-fi, but the Cylons are talking about God existing, and as viewers, we're like, well, what do we make of this? That's not a normal thing to have in hard, heavy, grounded science fiction like this. Eventually, what one of the Cylon characters suggests, or says outright, is this is what happened, is that God gave the Cylons souls. And so there is this physical sense in which the Cylons were created by human beings, but then chose to get involved at some point and give the Cylons souls. And so that, for those of us who would say, well, you can't be a person in the same sense that humans are persons unless you have that non-physical, non-tangible soul element. And so I think that is this a program malfunctioning and rationalizing or trying to deceptively create the impression that Cylons have personhood? How are we supposed to interpret it? Of course, the final episode gets wonky. I don't need to get in all that. All that to say, I feel like the way this is being written, there is room to interpret it either way. And I appreciate at least that being the case. Well, then in the very next scene, we have another interesting conversation going on between the Amazo construct, whose name's is Jadestone. That's right. They're on the page in front of me. Jadestone, who gained will of some kind as a result of the events of absolute power, and part of Alan Scott's, I believe it was like his energy getting inside of Jadestone. Anyway, Jadestone gained will in some sense. And so potentially personhood at the same time. I think that's still up in the air, given how that's been handled with his writing. But then we also have Aya, also reintroduced by Adams from the Green Lantern animated series. And they are together puzzling over this situation and what to do about it. And there's a pained, emotional expression on Aya's face saying, yet, despite what's happened to everybody else, Jadestone, we remain fully functioning. Jadestone cuts her off and says, because we are not organic life forms. You are a sentient AI placed in the Interceptor, which is the spaceship, while I discovered willpower and a mission to protect the central power battery. Whatever our input perceives as emotion is merely programming, a false construct. So simulated. It's simulating emotions, but it's not actually emotions. She puzzles over this, again, has a pained expression on her face, and then she says, maybe you're right. Then she adds, but my emotions are what kept me alive, hoping to return here to my friends, it all felt so real. And I think we are meant to believe that Aya is really having feelings, really having emotions, but at the same time, I want to ask, well, how do we know? Even when no one else is watching, a machine, a program, could conceivably be programmed to go through the motions of statistically likely responses that would be in accordance with human patterns of emotion. Nevertheless, they would still be just coming down to cause and effect, stimulus and reaction. A really interesting question to ask yourself, but it might ruin some entertainment for you, is, am I emotionally incentivized to accept this AI character as a person? And very often we are. If we want to hold to a true concept of dualism in terms of personhood, in terms of human personhood being composed of both the physical components, our brain, our nervous system, all these other things, and a non-physical component, our soul, our spirit, if we want to hold on to that belief that true personhood requires both of those, then we will have to very doggedly impose upon fiction a hardness of our hearts against the desire they're trying to create to get us to empathize with a character. Now, why would you do that? It kind of ruins the movie. There's no point in really doing that. I understand that. I mean, like, there's certainly times where I'm just like, okay, I'm setting this aside. I'm not actually giving up on the belief itself that the dualistic nature of human personhood is actually real. I'm not giving up on that as a belief, but for the sake of entering into the story construct in front of me, the story they want to tell, the ideas they want to present, I'm willing to set that aside. It's, what do you call it? The suspension of of disbelief. Well, then John Stewart's mom ring flies in and says, just because we're not connected to the emotional spectrum doesn't mean what we're feeling isn't real. Well, that depends on what you mean by we and whether or not there is a center of consciousness from which the ring can say we and me. Feeling also depends on what do you mean by feeling And what do you mean by real? Well, they start to get into it. Jadestone then says, Lantern Stewart's ring poses an intriguing question. Query, what is real? Mom Ring replies, we are, because we exist. Okay, so you are a thing that exists. Does that mean you're a person, though? Or could you be something else that exists? She goes on, or it goes on, to say the only difference between us and them is what we're made of. We're all programs, dear, some organic and others like us inorganic. So this is putting forth the idea that humans, like machines, are basically just cause and effect simulations, cause and effect mechanisms in machines, in which case choice isn't really real, is it? And that would be the consistent naturalistic worldview, the consistent atheistic worldview would have to say that we are all just cause and effect wet machines, and that what we call choice is actually an illusion. We don't truly have choice, but it's all just a very, very complex sequence of cause and response. Well, the writers very wisely recognize we can't get stuck on this topic for too long. Jadestone says, interesting. I must reflect on your summation. And I'm like, yeah, we all should, because I'm not sure this really makes sense. I'm actually thinking that there's a lot of problems with it here. But then Mom Ring says, you do that, but existential debate aside, you two seem to be the only ones concerned about what's happening here, blah, 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 blah. And then they go on to solving the problem at hand. Well, part of that solution is for Mom Ring to go to some of these folks that lost their emotions and say, it's only logical that we combine our abilities for our continued survival, no? And then they respond saying, yes, that sounds reasonable. Mom Ring replies, as I knew it would. But what's interesting to me about this is, are they then, if they are literally without any emotion at all, they wouldn't necessarily have a feeling of self-preservation. So then why would they want to survive? What would be motivating them to survive? I would have to allow for the idea, if they are completely without emotion, I'd have to allow for the idea that they see life as having objective value, and that there's an ought that they should be pursuing. Even if they are not feeling a draw to do certain things, there are values that ought to be pursued, that their purpose morally obligates them to make certain choices completely removed from emotion. And this, I think, is very compatible with the Christian worldview. The biblical worldview would not say that, emotions are not important, emotions are not valuable. They certainly are. There's something wrong if we are not being emotional beings. But our duties, our purpose, should be pursued independently of our emotions, if our emotions are leading us to want to divert away from our purpose, divert away from those oughts that are in front of us, given what Scripture reveals about God and humanity and what humanity was made by God for. At that point, it's sort of an issue of objective value, and that one ought to pursue that which has objective value, regardless of what your feelings about it are. And certainly as Christians, there are times where we need to do that, where we can't be led around by our feelings. In particular, our feelings that are contrary to a biblical perspective on things. Now, actually, our feelings can change. Our feelings can be shaped when we reflect on relevant or on particular truths that are relevant to our situation that we're not currently thinking about. It can change our perspective on things. For example, if someone older than me, let's say by 30 years, is telling me I'm a horrible person and insulting me in all these terrible ways, that might hurt my feelings. I tend to have respect for people that are older and further along in life than I am, and so I might that might really feel like a knife in the gut. But if I remember in, say, this particular hypothetical situation, that this person is suffering from dementia, and that they believe that I am a Nazi from World War II or something like that, they have this totally warped perspective on who I am, then reflecting on that truth would change the way I feel about the situation, and those insults would not have they would not cause the feeling of hurt anymore, because there's a truth that I'm bringing to mind very relevant to how I'm perceiving this situation. And so in that way, so many times there are truths that we need to bring to mind that can help shape our emotions. But in lieu of, having the knowledge of what specific truths we ought to be bringing to mind that would help with our emotions in a given situation, if our emotions are leading us away from what we ought to be doing, then that's a time where we certainly cannot be led by our emotions. Adding to this conversation is Guy Gardner, who kind of reflects, talking to Aya, for the first time in forever, I feel calm, not doing what my gut tells me. And then he reflects on that, saying, this is probably the best version of me there is. And there's maybe some truth to that. Obviously, he's not having the complete human experience we're meant to have as God created us when he's cut off from his emotions. But at the same time, Guy is a very flawed character who allows himself to be led around by his emotions without really following the truth and just kind of going with his gut. That leads to all kinds of problems. And so certainly in that sense, there has been an improvement in this situation, in Guy's behavior and the way he's operating in the world. In another situation, Kyle Rayner reveals the truth about what happened to him in the Source Wall. There was a big event where it was thought for a little bit that he died, and then there was some fallout from that, kind of a status quo change, a big Green Lantern event, and it was like, okay, this is the new status quo now. This is what Kyle discovered. This is what he told us when he came out. And one Green Lantern says to Kyle, hey, Kyle Rayner used the entities of the emotional spectrum to replenish the Source Wall. Aya says, is that true, Kyle? He says, no, it is not. And then goes on to say, it is easier to explain now that I don't feel regret, shame, or guilt. And man, isn't this so true? There are just some truths about ourselves, about choices we've made in the past, that we are not able to face when we have these intense feelings of regret, shame, or guilt. And a lot of Christians, I think, unnecessarily still operate in this imprisonment of regret, shame, or guilt because they're not fully applying and relying on the tireless grace of Jesus, that when we truly rely on it, allows to put a magnifying glass to ourselves and really acknowledge all the ugliness that maybe otherwise we're just not willing to face, because we just think, oh my gosh, I messed up, I made this choice, I have this ugliness going on inside of me in my heart. Doesn't that just make me a horrible person? Wouldn't other people just think these horrible things about me? But if we are remembering a few truths, one, that it's God's estimation of us that is far more important than any other humans, and two, that we have been forgiven, and that tireless forgiveness is on an ongoing basis afforded to us because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. That like every moment is a new, fresh moment where we can start over and say, you know what, I don't have to be weighed down by the guilt, shame, regret of what I did yesterday. I can move forward in a better direction. Yes, there's a sense in which we should still mourn that that's what we did, but we don't need to let those feelings keep us from truly seeing our faults, our wrongs, and what we need to work on. So in this situation, it's not Kyle reflecting on the grace of Jesus, of course. That'd be a crazy, wild thing to see in a DC comic. But even so, by other means, he has these feelings of regret, shame, and guilt stripped away, and he's able to be more honest as he reflects back on something that happened, choices he made, experiences that he had. And I think this is just a wonderful little bit of insight coming out in this moment. Anyway, that doesn't touch on every single little moment that had some philosophical meat to it, but those are the main ones that stood out to me. Very interesting. Still enjoying just kind of the story in general, but especially as it explores ideas of emotion, ideas of truth, and ideas of personhood. Just some meaty stuff going on in the Green Lantern Starbreaker Supremacy story. And again, that was Green Lantern Corps number 7. All right, well, this week I have chosen the Green lantern ring, which sometimes I choose when I am reading something that's kind of like, it's got some philosophical meat to it, or other reasons that I need to really think and discern. Like Jeremy Adams expressed in my interview with him, I have never been able to see will as an emotion. Will is something that I think we use to overcome emotion, to will ourselves to think and to try to think reasonably and rationally despite what we may be feeling. And so whenever my brain really goes to work kind of sorting through some philosophical stuff in a DC comic, that's when I feel like the green ring is certainly appropriate. Anyway, I think those are all of my thoughts on comic books for now. As always, love getting your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Hey, if you want this content as a monthly podcast instead, you can check out the Essential Issues monthly podcast and a ton more content over at christiangeekcentral.com, made for you as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.